When planning a feature for development, it's not exactly what you think. It's not for the purpose of knowing every single line of code you want to write, or even figuring out everything that might block you during the development process. Planning a development feature is specifically designed to help you understand the following 3 things. Number 1 is to understand your problem better. Number 2 is to create a plan for development. And number 3 is to set a goal so that you can know when to stop developing. All 3 of these points are extremely important when it comes to knowing what you can deliver in a certain amount of time. Regardless of how many experienced software developers and project managers says that a timeline estimate is a guess, which I fully agree with, they all still ask you for an estimate on how long it's going to take. So they want you to still make that guess. With this process, we can probably get a little bit better at guessing our estimates. This tutorial will go over the planning of a feature that we will develop, or you, if you want to contribute to the open source project. The feature we are planning to build is location-based results. When running a food delivery service, it's important to show the user only the restaurants that are in their vicinity to ensure for a speedy food delivery. We'll go through each of the points above and do concrete planning for those feature steps as well. Let's start off by understanding our problem. This is a crucial part of the feature development planning. You need to understand the problem that you are trying to solve. The word problem sometimes has a negative connotation, so we can rephrase it as understanding your feature if you want to. There are different levels of information that you are privy to during the process leading up to this. But at this point of development feature planning, it's only the technical and the actual problem feature that matters. It's always good to know the business reasons and the impact it will have on our clients, but those problems were solved before we got to the technical development planning. So the way that I break down a problem, which has been very successful, is by walking through what we want to happen. But before we can do that, let's give a single user story name to the feature. This feature can be summarized with the following sentence. When a user opens the app, they should see only the restaurants close to them. Now that we have our user story, we can start exploring our solutions. We'll write down a minimum of 2 solutions. Now beginners won't have these solutions stashed away in their heads, so there's some research that will have to go into this before writing down your solutions. More experienced developers can combine different tools and solutions from their past experiences, and using the engineering knowledge they can come up with a viable solution. For this section, I will write down 2 of the known solutions that I've dealt with, and we can explore the pros and cons of them both. The first one is to divide the restaurants into regions and return results per region. With this solution, we place the merchants in a specific region. This will be determined by the latitude and longitude they were entering when they fill in their restaurant information. When a user enters their address in the app for delivery, we figure out what region they are in and will only return the restaurants for that specific region. The pros of this system is that the region system will allow us to easily separate for drivers, for analytics, as well as for admin functionalities. The second pro is that there's less work to be done on the backend in terms of logic and time taken to return a query. The cons of this is that there's an exclusion of restaurants that might be similar distance but not in the same region if they operate on the border of certain cities. The second solution is results based on a radius or minimum distance from the user. With this solution, we don't really care about regions. Each restaurant will store their latitude and longitude, and we use the basic distance between latitude and longitude points algorithm to get an estimate of how far they are from the user. This will be done on the backend and will only return the restaurants that are available to the user. The response of the backend will be amended and will contain the distance from the user's selected address to the restaurant. The pros of this is that it's a straightforward implementation and it's not affected by city borders. The cons are that the backend has to do these calculations during the request, which will extend the total request time. The second and more important con is that this is not very accurate. An example would be if a restaurant is 10 kilometers away, but the path to take that is about 18 kilometers long. That is almost double and is not a very accurate prediction. The third con is that there's no way for a restaurant to determine if they want to show up for a specific distance, which is a concern to ensure that their ratings don't get pummeled by long delivery times. After laying out our two solutions, it's time to talk to a senior in your team or the architect if you have one at your disposal. In our case, I'll choose number 1. It's a bit easier to understand and to handle as well in code. We don't need a highly optimized algorithm to calculate the information we require. Now that we've determined our solution, we need to come up with our development plan. The beginning of that process is to explore the selected solution. In this step, we need to ensure that every question we have is answered. These questions will arise as we walk through the implementation and find points that are not entirely clear at a high level. It's not to determine the implementation details. That will be done by the implementing developer. This is actually to determine specifically the following 3 things at a product architecture level. Number 1 is how things will interact with each other. Number 2 is where the information or data will come from. And number 3 is what the process will be for getting or servicing this data to the user. To make use of this functionality, we know that the merchants on the system has to be divided into regions. So the first question is, how do we determine which region a merchant belongs to? This question falls into the third point, which is what is the process of getting this information? To answer this question, there are 3 solutions that we could use. Number 1, given that the merchant onboarding will be an operations task and we will have ground sales representatives to onboard the merchants, they should know the area well enough to place the restaurants in a certain region manually. Number 2, we use the latitude and longitude information supplied when creating the merchant, and using the Google geocoding API, we can figure out which region the merchant belongs to. And number 3, we use the city as the region. Now, out of the points above, I choose number 3. It's the easiest to implement and the most straightforward at the moment. The next question is, now that we have these regions, how do we store it on the backend? This question holds a lot of merit on Firestore because there are 2 options that we can use to store this information. So in this option, we have a root collection called regions. Each document in this collection will be a region with the region name as the ID. And inside of each of those documents, there will be a sub-collection where we have all of the region information. The pros to this is that it's easy to see in the database how many regions we have. It's easy to query for merchants in a region, and it's easy to manage details per region if we have a details document for that region. The cons of this is that there's additional substructure for merchants. Even though the merchant is a first-party data member, it won't be one of our root collections. This is just a technical thing, so it won't really matter, but in the code, sometimes these things can be confusing. The second option is to store the merchant under a single merchant's collection. With this option, the merchants are stored in a single merchant's collection, and we save the region as one of the properties on the document. The only pro for this is that the merchants are all available under a single collection. The cons for this is that it'll be difficult to find merchants for regions in the database when just looking at the database. And then the last con is that we need to do an additional query to get the merchants for a specific region. Now with those 2 laid out, the one that we are going to be doing is to store the merchants under a region collection. This concludes our backend requirements from the perspective of the merchant region management. And now we can move on to the feature from the perspective of the user's region management. The first thing we have to figure out is, how will we determine a user's region? Given the geocoding functionality that exists, the easiest solution at this point is to use the city as the region of the user. Now that we have all the planning done, we can get the actual development plan complete. At this point, we 100% understand the solution for the functionality that we want. We haven't talked about any code, and that should be exactly how it is when you are planning this functionality. At this point, the development plan can start to ensure that we have a plan that covers all the work required, in addition to giving guidance to the QA team and what to test and how they should expect things to work. We'll start with the non-client work for the backend. There's nothing we need to do for this functionality to work because the client will insert the data as we require it. But we do need to have the region and merchants within there to test against for our development. So there's going to be one single task for the backend, which will be set up fake data for region merchant generation when running on the emulator. For this task, we want to generate a region for Cape Town, and in that region we will add 10 merchants. Now we have all of our fake data functionality set up for our emulator, so we'll just go in there and modify that in a future video. That's everything we need for the backend, so we can move on to the front end work. The first task that we can identify is when selecting an address, if there's no merchants for that address, we need to show the user some feedback. So what we'll do is when selecting an address in the address selection view, we'll check if a region exists in the regions collection. If it doesn't exist, we'll show a not serviced yet UI. If it does exist, we'll simply navigate to the home view. Now at this point I want to mention that you should always be mindful of work spawned from the work that's being planned, and above we can see that we'll need a design for the not serviced yet UI that we are talking about in that ticket. For now we can just use the dialog UI that we have in our design system, which will spawn a new task. That task will be to build the custom dialog UI based on our design system. For this we will create a dialog builder that produces the following dialog result. It should take in the title, description and a main button title. And we should be able to swap between the tick and a close sign in the circle on top. The last task we have to create is that when we get to the home view or the browse view, that we show the user the merchants from their region. The first thing we want to do here is when we land on the home view, we want to query for the Firestore regions collection and get the city from that. And then we simply want to list all those results as merchant items. Those merchant items will look like the design we have in our design system. And we also want to add a note to indicate to the dev that this UI widget has to go into our box UI package. And that is what we call a development plan. We will have 4 distinct tasks, and these can be implemented by separate developers if we wanted that to happen. In this case we kind of do, because I'd like the community to contribute to boxed out as well. It'll make things go faster and I'll be able to review and merge in that code myself. The last thing we need to do is to define the end goal of this feature. For the functionality to show location-based results, we are basically complete. What we need to be able to do by the end of this feature is to select an address as a user, and if the address is not serviced, we have to show the user that it is not serviced. If it is serviced, we go to the home view, and on the home view, we want to show the user only merchants that are within their city. And that is it. We don't need to build the merchant details view yet. This is all we need to complete our feature, and that's all that we will develop. We have our acceptance criteria, we know how to test it, we have our development tasks, and now we can start writing the code. Thank you guys for watching, and I hope this was helpful. If you haven't subscribed, please do, and I'll see you guys next week when we start developing this tutorial.